And Elden Ring now is a massive success. It was announced in June 2019, years ago, from Software, and they seem to be doing something that they had personally never tried before. One of the things was mixing in George R.R. Martin's mythology and world with the gameplay chops of a From game. And now it's the sixth biggest game ever on Steam in concurrent players. But as that number suggests, it's not going to be for everyone. Sort of like Instagram filters are just EMB reshade for old faces. Everyone's going to like something different. But for me, damn do I like it. And even just coming out here, the first thing you notice, and especially something I'm going to talk about across the gamut of gameplay and all that kind of stuff, is how the world changes. Sorry, I had to remove a little bit of a spoiler there for people. I'm trying to unspoiler absolutely everything in this. But walking around the game world and realizing how the overworld works across the various different dungeons, I'm going to talk about all that, the way the actual sacred sites works. It is a phenomenal looking game when it comes to its art. And I get it. We're going to talk a little bit about tech at a later time, but that's certainly something that I can see some people having an issue with. And as I speak of that, I get a little bit of a buffer issue there. You're definitely going to see that in this game. I still am one of the unfortunate ones who have the occasional stutter in the title. But I think right from the start, we notice a couple things about Elden Ring that is different from the other titles before them. Not everyone likes to work through mystery, and that matters when From Software does have a dogged desire to sort of dole out information like dirty bits of bread on the road, leading that Hansel and Gretel player through danger, only to maybe find out that the trail itself is worse than the oven. But holy moly, what a good looking trail. I love everywhere you go in this game, you can just see out these vistas and see these locations that you can go to or that you've been, and it gives that connection to the entire game world, something that was a little bit more difficult due to the serpentine ways that Dark Souls was originally modeled after. There's a certain synergy that good open world games have when their worlds, their NPCs, their creatures all fit together, when they feel like one large experience instead of many discrete ones separated by specific areas or actions. Elden Ring isn't exactly going for a full open world. It's going for a stretchiness of the Dark Souls experience across two layers, the overworld and the dungeons or underworld locations and their experiences. It's profoundly different, yet if you're a fan of Dark Souls, it can feel ultimately familiar. As well as the enviable chemistry between the creators and George R.R. Martin, who so many people remember from the series Game of Thrones and the books there. He helped frame the world for sure, but I remember him for something else. A DM in 1987, creating a world for another massive series known as Wildcards, and how that framework and those ideas there are where I believe some of his masterworks are being displayed. Let's jump into why I think that mixture between the creators and George R.R. Martin is so important and why it worked so well. First, when George R.R. Martin was young, he played a Dungeons and Dragons game. Well, it wasn't actually that. It was a different series of games that I'll talk about in a second. But the players for this game were science fiction writers themselves, including Gail Miller, John J. Miller, Melinda Snodgrass, Walter John Williams, and Martin served as game master for this game. Now, remembering that just 4 years prior to 1987, around 1983, 1985, D&D itself was revised and expanded by Frank Metzer as a series of 5 boxed sets, including the basic rules, which was the red cover, I believe, the expert rules, which was blue for sure, companion, and I think the master rules were black. There was also immortal rule if you wanted to explore sort of what it was like to be ultra powerful. The reason why I bring this up is because this was a time when D&D was starting to flourish, at least back there with the sci-fi nerd groups and the people who were really the creatives of that particular time. While creating a role-playing game for Wildcards, they used the Chaosium Games Super World Rulebook with George as the DM. He gathered everyone around him, this massive number of authors at the time, to play the game. Now, this was a truly collaborative process where the D&D game also became the framework for the world in the novels. This is much the same way that Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman worked with others to turn their original AD&D game into Dragonlance. I bring this up because that kind of collaboration is actually quite unusual, and I believe it was done at such a young time that it actually sort of set up R.R. Martin for preparing for things that he has dealt with now. Martin championed the same framework with Wildcards as we see with Elden Ring. In fact, simply stepping back into somewhat of the same role. From did not want him to write all the stories and did not want him to write all the world. They wanted him to create this framework, which speaks to why From Software stated it was so easy to work with him. This was not his first time. And it's probably not the first time you're saying, why is he talking about all this? But bear with me, because I think this all really did end up flavoring everything that happened with him and From Software. he created a game, but other novelists took various characters out of his framework and made stories. Here, he created the mythology and the overarching lore and allowed for the game makers to be players themselves. It allowed From Software to look at this overarching mythology and put a story within it, thus creating what I think to be a really unique world, and one where you can actually tell that the developers themselves engaged in a bit of that mystery. And I do think that matters. I think that mystery is something that we see missing a lot of times, and you can certainly feel it within the game. Not everything perfectly makes sense, and that's fine because they never have in these kind of games, but there's something about it, that air of exploration, that's just been missing prior. And I think it's also noticeable in a lot of the locations that you actually see in the game. Everything from the world tree reminding us of old Viking lore, even the dead dude clubhouse you get with its suspicious round table where others like you, sort of Knights of the Tarnished, gather. These elements and these lores allowed for this team to come together and be surprised themselves, and I do believe that is one reason why so many people are calling this game a classic, and why I want to cover it today. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is the dungeons. I'm going to talk about everything, but I want to start there first. Now, you may not know, but dungeons are actually considered by many different game developers to be some of the trickiest parts to get correct in an RPG. It has to take the movements and abilities unique through the processes that the game player's already learned and merge them with the experiences and expectations of the developer upon the game player in those locations, as well as reinforcing the mechanics and, if it matters, furthering the narrative, the story within that title inside those dungeons. Just looking at some of the characters' movesets can identify what would or wouldn't work in a particular dungeon or how it was going to work. I mean, even in here, think about it this way. If you took an old-style Bard's Tale dungeon grid-based movement system based on north, east, south, and west, and then you put it in a character kind of situation for Assassin's Creed, it would feel like absolute dog crap, unless there were very specific rules stating that maybe it was like a chessboard kind of thing, but it would have to be a one-off. If you want the dungeons to not just be difficult, but also condense the skills a player has learned up until that point, you got to make sure that the game doesn't have items or movements that a dungeon early on requires, or you have to alert them that they can't continue and they have to come back. From does that in all of their games, and they continue to do it here, and that's with keys. Now, it's not unique in that they're the only ones doing it. It's just that it has a very D&D style to it, where you have to fight to actually get the keys to go backwards to open the places. However, the game really lets the freedom of the player reign here. It allows for the player to go out and get those keys, to go out and get those items, and return to whatever place they want. Also, looking here, I realize that this torch is out and how it throws sort of a dual shadow on this location, and it adds that sense, just a little sense of like, uh-oh, is this a spot I need to worry about? Now, and I'll talk about color work in a bit, but if you guys probably noticed, maybe you didn't, I absolutely adore the super pristine white of some of the candles versus the more yellow, tarnished, sort of old style antique glow of the others. It adds this cool context, like a texture to everything that it's easy to miss. From Software has always been the kind of game developer that states, if you want to go into this dungeon, you absolutely can. We just don't know if you'll be able to get out again. However, in the past, it wasn't open world. It was usually 1, 2, 3. And a game player usually had an idea of, hey, I can't go here. I need to learn, or I need to go somewhere else. The open world can make that a little bit muddy. With the dungeon set underneath, or at the very least, sort of to the side of the overworld, moving around the overworld, you find one and you sort of know you're entering a special place. They've really elevated that game so that you know just by the traversal, this place may be dangerous. That, of course, doesn't include overworld mini-bosses, which I'll also talk about. What you find in Elden Ring is maybe 3, if not 4, identifiable dungeon styles, sort of markable types. I'm going to go through those shortly. The first is their mini dungeon. These are no really easier way to describe as very small locations, many of them hidden out of the way within spots that you get to that can be quite easily defined and sometimes quite difficult, but they're usually for just killing enemies, maybe learning a little bit about stealth and going into the location, sneaking around and looking regardless, and just getting items from those. In fact, many of them don't really have a boss. One element you'll find across many of the smaller dungeons is a desire to show the gamer various attributes they may need to understand when facing something on the overworld. And you definitely notice this when you're engaging within the title. You go into one of these mini dungeons and you meet an enemy, for example, the imps, that start leaping down from the ceilings, roofs, and you start to realize this is something that I'm going to need to prepare for, because it may actually be your first real experience with any kind of creature that goes on the walls, on the ground, and on the ceiling. Also, your first dungeons, no matter how small they are, do introduce you to a cramped movement style, a movement style that is far more equal to what we've seen in other From Software games. You have to acclimatize the game player to this gameplay state change that occurs when you go in there, of removing the freedom of just rolling around all the time or jumping on a giant horse, instead being more contained, being more up close, and just forcing the game player to utilize space and distance and their own tactics and abilities without the ability to retreat as quickly or as easily as they have in the overworld. This is a very cool section of the game because the player gets to dole out when they want to learn this, and it can actually bump up the difficulty if a player learns it later. Now, in Elden Ring, you sort of have a secondary kind of dungeon as well. And these are the dungeons that are a little bit larger, and they're usually in some way connected to the locations themselves. They don't actually even have to be dungeons in the typical style. You may think of dungeons like an opening and you walk in. It's not always that way in Elden Ring or in Dark Souls games. A lot of the times when it's out in the open for you to walk into, it's actually one of the more dangerous spots in the game. Regardless, though, you'll enter into these mid-scale dungeons, and these dungeons that usually have a boss or a semi-boss, a character that's there to not only surprise the game player, but also to be that little skill step. When the player is done defeating that character, that mini-boss, their skills should be at a slightly higher level than when they first faced them. And the skill gap of dungeons that we see here, a lot of other games have done this as well. We've seen it in Neo and The Surge, has certainly been one of the more closely copied elements of From games that we've seen in others. However, where other titles usually end up rewarding the game player, there are a couple places within Dark Souls titles as well as Elden Ring that don't really offer you much when you end up beating the boss or when you get to the end. These mini dungeons, as you will, actually are there really to be that skill gap and to teach the player, to make the player understand maybe a puzzle or how a particular situation is going to work, or understanding inflicting status damage. But at the same time, you'll actually get to the end and you'll get the world's most horrible talisman. You'll just get a talisman. You're like, this is almost useless. That's because the skill that you got going through it is the actual gift. It is the treasure. And that mystery of you maybe putting on that talisman and thinking that's all you got, where you don't actually pick up on the fact that no, what you actually understood is how to deal with two other types of enemies, how now to deal with a status infection that you may get at any particular time. The game world there actually allows for you, when you go into those dungeons and pick up those different tactics, those different abilities, allow for you to use those skills at a quicker timing to defeat the next enemies more easily, even if you haven't upgraded some particular weapon. In fact, while there's treasure in those locations, like I said, many times it is not a weapon and maybe something else that you're actually getting from them. And again, this absolutely isn't new. This is the balanced kind of gameplay that we see in many locations. But what they've done here is returned the dungeon back to a video game. A lot of games, those dungeons aren't that difficult. And this is where we talk about the third scale of dungeon in this game. And these are the main ones, the main locations where massive enemies are. They really sometimes do look like dungeons to you, usually. There's some kind of major boss. It doesn't have to be a story boss. Elden Ring has many dungeons with bosses in them at the end that aren't really story bosses, but they do hold tighter to the From Software idealized element that's maybe 1, 2, 3 different ways to go about it. And again, we haven't talked about the overworld yet. You take out enemies, they usually are going to be large enough that they'll have a sacred stone somewhere within those dungeons so that you can save at least a little bit of the progress as you move forward. These dungeons could be castles, they could be caverns, they could be small areas of destroyed towns, it could be magical locations in the end. They all resonate, though, with that exact same frequency that we've come to expect, meaning an understanding of how to take everything that you know or have learned and put it against the enemies, and then the major enemy within that level and within that dungeon taking you on. What From does that's different than most other games is they say you decide when you have that ability. You decide when you think you have that experience. You decide when you're ready. Many other games will give you a lot of notifications. They'll tell you need to be this certain thing, you need to be this certain level. That's not how a From Software game works, and it certainly isn't when you look at Elden Ring and you look at its overworld. And we're going to segue into that by discussing one element of the way the game does or doesn't give information. And this always reminds me of how the game harkens back to old first edition or second edition D&D, when maps were not just about where you got, it was how you got there, about what was between you and there. The use of the markers for everything in this game is vital. Identifying locations, items, people, and sometimes marking them in my own sort of journal on the side. It brings the analog real journal back into gaming without any quick filters or easy flicking between pages. something that maybe some people will miss, but for a lot of people who like that older style analog, it does bring in a unique chemistry between the real world sometimes and the digital. Something where instead of going and looking at a guide online, if you're playing this and there are no guides, a lot of times you've got your little journal set and you're like, marker 1 is this NPC, marker 2 looks like a dragon, marker 3 looks like this. We not only mark the trajectory of our desired outcomes in those games, but the tragic circumstances of player deaths, of monsters, of unique parts of the world, because in the heyday of gaming, a single well wasn't just to get water or get a coin out of it. It could have been a water weird. No one knew the preconceived ideas that everybody expects today because there weren't any. And in many ways, From has tried to return to that ideal where there is a surprise and there isn't as many preconceived notions. Dungeons are about using those skills from the player and rewarding them usually, but many times Dark Souls and Elden Ring don't remind you of that. Many times it's just death, but you can test death and you can taste it. See how much damage you can do. In Elden Ring, there are some small locations, some tiny bits out of the way places where you can go and you can explore. You can take out and look around, and you don't have assassin's vision or nom vision like we did in Mafia 3. There's no survivor ping in the game. The survivor ping many times is stabbing somebody in the back to see how much damage your sword does. And this is one of the places of mastery that From Software has hit with Elden Ring, and that is figuring a great deal out for yourself. FromSoft didn't just stop there. They also looked into how a player will figure things out. And then they wanted to branch out and find more gamers. How do you inform all of those people how to jump into this without maybe having them have played a FromSoft game prior? Well, that's where the open world comes into it. When it comes to the overworld itself, when it comes to the desire of From Software to deliver to you an overworld that multiple people can jump into, I think it's important to understand exactly how game makers go about making games. One of the things to understand is that gamers may know exactly what they like, but they may not be able to describe exactly what they like. They don't always have the same expertise to explain to you what they want in a game. They can just tell you what felt good. In focus testing, in fact, you'll see this a lot of times. Many times a person may know exactly what they find fun, and they may say that this particular quest in a game was the most enjoyable in the game. But if you go back and you start to talk to them, you'll find out that quest had 3 parts, and only the last part was incredibly enjoyable to all gamers. The first 2 parts possibly were actually not that fun at all. But what happened is you got into the 3rd part of the quest, the enjoyment ramped up, and that's the last thing you may remember. In many ways, you can go somewhat and compare that to a bad movie or a very good movie and the ending, or at least the last half of the game or movie, and how it affects your remembrance of the entire title. It may make everything fall apart, or maybe it makes everything come together. And what From has tried to do is make sure that they truncate parts 1 and 2. Now, there's a chart in business called the Kawasaki Matrix. This basically is where it shows your business and how you're doing, or basically anything you want to track. There's a spread of being unique or valuable to everybody, if your market is large or if it's niche, and I'll try to put it here on the screen. From Software, when you look at them making a game, they have to decide where they fit. What niche do they fit within? If you look at the way Dark Souls has been put together, this is something that's been discussed in past GDCs as well. They're unique, and they also fit a very particular audience segment, a segment that enjoys difficulty, a segment that feels like when you beat a game, it's an achievement, that they understood and understand that what they did was probably more difficult than the status quo title, unless that status quo title was turned onto a harder difficulty. This also speaks towards how fans can get into these drawn-out arguments about who does what better, where the uniqueness of a large world is, tons of quests is it no longer unique? A lot of games have shifted to be more expansive, to be larger. That's very simply taken into account with the Kawasaki Matrix. You can look at it and see exactly where that fits. It's easy to look at this world and think to yourself, oh, they're just catering to the general gamer. But look at what they did. The overworld is not exactly that. It is a larger place than you might expect, but it is quite dangerous. In fact, the overworld has mini bosses, and bosses just waiting to kick your ass almost everywhere in the locations, something I've discussed in the reviews and otherwise. When you're talking about dungeons and that feeling of tension, most Dark Souls have that in a very particular funneled, segmented, hub-like status and hub-like way. That's not the same in Elden Ring. There's a sense of pervading mystery, the mystery of death, the mystery of location, the mystery of quest, but also just the mystery of what have I learned and how can I use it in the game. You'll see tutorials at the beginning, sort of level the playing field a little bit and try to explain to new gamers so that they at very least understand some of the nuances, some of the smaller parts that exist in Dark Souls game. But at the same time, they don't alienate people who look at those and say, I already know all this. Why are you showing it to me? They just show enough to get newcomers going, and they spread out a little bit to allow newcomers to engage with it and allow those people who think they know what they're doing to jump out there and try. What From did is they have these basic tutorials. Now you can read these as well as the locations that back up those tutorials when you're exploring in the open world. A player can't see the boundaries of some room and think, this is where I need to learn shooting. The overworld doesn't allow that. To put it more bluntly, FromSoft knows that a player is likely going to see something and what they're going to see and what they're going to do. And they probably know what most people are going to attempt. So they build a game world around that, the understanding around that knowing, and understanding their own players and knowing that, hey, we need to allow them to break off the beaten path. And if they do, what's going to be there? What's acceptable to be there? And feels like it's something that is, at the very least, a game kind of situation. There's no linear explanation for step-by-step methods anywhere in the game. In my own personal ideas and experience and just my honest opinion is that its big claim to fame will be its overworld. And the fact that the overworld and the dungeons beneath it and above it and beside it allow for a gamer to feel something a little bit more akin to the great stories of old and the myths of old, the stories about the Odyssey and various other different characters going about incredibly difficult tasks, and the importance of deadly dungeons in a lot of those old stories. Game dungeons aren't that deadly. Go into them and you just sort of know that's a place to grind. We talk about it all the time. Dark Souls turns that back on its head, or technically refreshes it and resets it and said, no, dungeons are going to be absolutely terrifying. But then Elden Ring says, hey, let's put a point on this and do it a little bit different. We're going to have some insane difficulty here or there, but we're going to also allow for this overworld, which allows for a sense of travel and movement for gamers who have always wanted that kind of thing and want to explore and ride around massive fleeting fields and exploring swamps and then going into a dungeon, even though those swamps and fields may be highly dangerous on their own. But it does give players a sense of connection if this is their first title with other open world games. I mean, just look at how many of our myths, how many of our stories in the old world, the old myths, all sort of revolve around travel to dangerous places. Going down to fight Medusa, unlike Dark Souls, where the Tarnished is sort of an undead chasing the undead and defeating them. What happens in Elden Ring is a little bit different. It's that these rings have been smashed and it's about going out and saving them with other Tarnished, going out to sort of help find these pieces. It's a different story slightly, but at the same time, the character and the exploration that you do should be more accustomed for everybody. Everybody should be accustomed to it a little bit more. Going down to fight that Medusa. And hey, if you want to be in the overworld and fight some demon dogs, you can do that too. It just means those demon dogs may still kick your ass. Or you can ride your horse away. And that's where we're going to talk about horse riding and exploration. The Dark Souls games have never shied away from being a little bit more linear in their presentation, the ability for you to go here or there, but you mostly know where you probably shouldn't go, or you find out pretty quickly. It's a 1, 2, 3 kind of thing with your choices, and you sort of have to decide here or there. But here, Elden Ring says, get on your horse, go many places, get on your horse, test things out. There's experimentation here that is broader and wider than we've seen before. And for a gamer that happens in and maybe has the feeling of this slight lessening of tension that happens in the game world and in the overworld, it's just not as tight. It allows for them to explore. Even if they get killed, there's still a bevy of options that they can use. They can still turn right down that valley instead of going left up into the cliffs. They can decide not to go into the cavern. They can go to the right and go to the beach. These are options that will allow for a gamer to live just a little bit longer in the overworld in particular, which does change as you get farther into the game. But at least in the short term, it allows for people to explore a little bit more and for them to understand a little bit more about the game world and the requirements for it, for the ability of the player to understand just a little bit more about traversal. What can you and can't you do with the horse? You realize it can double jump. That opens up various ways in which you can explore. It also opens up avenues and mysteries to you. It can show you a new dungeon, a new way to decide how to go into an old dungeon, around a corner. How should you enter this place? Because it's not necessarily out and about, and a lot of the exploration here is a mysterious corner that you may find, something we've seen in the prior games, but here opened out more due to the larger amount of exploration and the freedom that the horse allows. And I do think that one of the major parts that the horse allows is for a person who maybe learns in a slightly different way than a typical Dark Souls player will be able to learn in this game. You'll be able to jump on that horse and run away if you want. Take on an enemy a little bit easier if you want. Give yourself a little bit more of a variability than you may have had in prior titles. And What we saw in Sekiro, we definitely saw sort of a branching out of how to move around the game world. We now see come to at least one part of its fruition here with the horse in Elden Ring, and the ability for a player to feel a little bit less stressed in some locations and learn a little bit more. Because let's be honest, I covered this in the review, I covered this in why I thought this game might be a classic before it even came out, is the idea that not everybody learns the same way. And I don't necessarily feel that this game is really skewing towards, oh, it's made for general audiences. I think actually From realized that maybe people do learn a different way, and we want both kinds of players. We just need to understand and facilitate that ability. And one of the places where we see that is the building of the overworld and the art. I want to talk about From Software's use of color work in this game, the use of color theory, purples, their goals, their ability to make you see something. As I said in the review, it looks like Larry Elmore of Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms fame and his old paintings of high fantasy, and that directly feeds into the use of magic that the player character now can possess. There's a connection between you and what you can do and the overall look of the game world. And I think the use of the color and the changes that we see in this game have really elevated Elden Ring. I don't think I'd be speaking out of turn to say that for a lot of gamers, Larry Elmore, for at least a lot of role-player gamers, changed the way role-playing looked for them, especially when you look at it from the standpoint of prior and after. He was one of the premier artists, playing games for 2 to 3 decades going, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms. I believe he did some work for Dark Sun as well. But he was a highly prolific artist and excellent use of color work, something you'll see really when he took over and started doing a lot of TSR stuff and a lot of stuff for Dungeons & Dragons, Dragons of Spring Dawning, Summer Flame, and others, their covers, as well as, of course, Braum, who's another very popular artist of the time. But I think when you look back, you look at Larry Elmore's work and the way it sort of took off, especially when you go away from the rough-hewn look into something with just a little bit more color. It added a fantasy look to it, something that we see here as well. You could say Frank Franzetta, who certainly was an amazing artist for his time. He did things with a darker edge, and I would say that when we look at Elden Ring, you see some of those elements as well. Definitely something I would have expected, but a little bit more like Larry Elmore. While they all certainly have cribbed from other places, I definitely wouldn't say that they haven't. I do feel that when you add in the color work that they've done and the changes to the color work, it really does open up the game world for people that may have looked at the dark and gritty part of From titles and said, maybe it's not for me. But they still exist here. It's another way to sort of fool you. It's almost like the dungeons are the dark and gritty in a way. To understand just for a second how much Larry Elmore impacted D&D, I want to talk about this because I do believe when you talk to a lot of people who make role-playing games, you'll hear his name come up all the time. He was simply painting on the side. The president at the time of TSR actually saw his stuff and flew to his home, stayed at his home for dinner, and talked to him. He asked Larry how much Larry made in a year. Larry told him, and he said, we'll double it for that year. And we want you on Dungeons & Dragons. Larry said, oh, you know what? My wife, she has a job and we're stuck here. The president said, we'll double whatever she makes as well. When Larry said that they had a house that they were paying for and selling the house would be difficult, the president of TSR realized just how much this would open the door for other gamers and said, we'll help you sell the house so you can come and move and without having to worry about those kind of things. If that doesn't point to you how art and the changing of art and the changing of the look of something can do wonders, I don't know what else does. At the time, also, Larry brought in Jeff Easley, who was doing freelance work, and I know that I like Jeff Easley a lot. He loved his stuff, and they said, you know what, let's see if he'll hire you. Jeff basically turned in his paperwork, and they were like, yeah, we want you. They hired Clyde Caldwell, another absolute bombastic artist from that time. They were just putting together a great who's who for artistry, and that artistry has then resonated out from those times into the creators of today. A lot of people who are creating games are from that time period, and the reason why you may sit here and go, oh, From Software, I didn't think of it as sort of connected to old D&D games. Well, guess what? It is. It's very much like old D&D games, and that's why I think you're starting to see these things. From Software chose to make a more colorful, a more artistically fantastic looking location, and I can tell you the number of people who've told me that the reason why they're now looking at jumping into this game because of the way it looks is incredibly high, if not more there than for any other reason. Oh, I should probably add, somebody might say, well, what about Skyrim and stuff like that? Yeah, well, Skyrim and stuff like that also actually based on those prior artists. So all of that stuff, even the adjustments they have made sort of anti-artistry has gone the way of basically being some kind of rebound from the artistry we saw in the 80s. It's incredible. For a wider audience, I think overall the use of particular colors do resonate in a particular way. But it's also where they used them in this game. You have the lighter hues of purple. It's not very dark purple for the most part. It's a lighter purple, poor man's purple, but it works incredibly well to give the entire world this cool offset. Whenever you look at the horizon, whether it's green and verdant, whether it's something else, whether it's rocks or it's gray or grass, everything still has a defined separation from that purple when it doesn't really have that in a lot of other titles from these guys. And it gives you the feeling, once again, of exploration. This is something that works very well when you look at art of any kind and focal points in art, places and tricks that artists do to get you to look at a particular location. We see that also when you go into the swamps or the new locations. You get into this low, nasty swamp actually having a sort of light and airy feeling about it. It still feels claustrophobic, don't get me wrong, and mysterious for sure. But they changed up the work there. They add a sense of wonderment to it with a light mix of blue and purple again. And that dire feeling we see when you first go down into the first really boggy areas is there. But there's also this sense of magic, this sense of something mysterious on the other edge that actually works for me and works in ways that the prior games haven't. And it also connects to the magic. So we talk about color theory, we talk about magic and the connection there, and why I think the over-the-top colors, well, for them over the top, for most other developers these would be still considered muted, but you have the connection of the magic the player can use. Make no mistake, the magic in Elden Ring just feels more connected to the world. It allows for the atmosphere to resonate at a much higher level, not only because it is more colorful, it's more separated from the rest of the game world, so you can actually see it a little bit easier. Something that if you look back at Dark Souls games, sometimes the spells had almost a washed out look. Here, that is not what actually happens. It certainly does, I would say, look a little bit more like high-level Dragon's Dogma spells, and that higher fantasy feeling, more color feeling, and that goes directly in with the background, and it makes it make sense. What I mean by that is, what you're doing tonally makes sense with what you're seeing on the horizon. It makes sense with the overall world around it. The artistry of it makes sense. If you suddenly cast a spell and a rifle came out, even if it was neon blue and shining and shooting fiery bullets, you'd still be like, what? That doesn't really fit. But the magic that they chose and how it works now fits with the game world. In fact, I would argue that if you took the old kind of magic and you put it into what we see here, it would look very off-putting. Speaking of off-putting, one thing that I do like is the dichotomy between that colorful work, that color theory that we see, and the characters themselves. They still have that very ugly look. Everybody looks just a little bit wonky. There's nobody in this game ever who just looks like a normal person. It looks like Santa Claus is selling you stuff in the churches when you sit down the first time. These guys are very good at understanding how to alert the player of something different, something useful, something unique. Even if it's far off in the distance, not everything glints, but some things do. But most importantly, when there's a sacred site, for instance, that sacred site has this golden hue, this glittery, silvery mix of magic going around and indicating sort of like a trail for you to follow and go to. It's a bit of safety. And that ability for them to do that and still work it with the new changes that they have works so well. The moment when you look at it and you think to yourself, as long as I'm in sight of one of these sacred places, maybe I'll explore just a little bit more. It's a very cool adjustment that we see with these guys, and we don't see it in some other games that are sort of the Dark Souls style, where these guys have done a really good trick here, which is to basically give you a farther way indication of this so that you will explore more, you will feel safer. Even if you're not, you're still going to feel a little bit safer. You have the horse, which also makes you feel a little bit more, let's say, flexible in your ability to move around. And that understanding of all these things lets anybody, whether you're incredibly defensive or incredibly offensive in your gameplay style, it allows for them to feel like they can explore more. Excellent color work in the game. Excellent use of differentiation between the horizon and the actual sky itself, and how it gets you to continually want to move just a little bit more forward. And as doing so, you're going to fight those guys that look weird. You know, you got your weird looking normal guys, but I mean, looking at the enemies, now, I think a lot of these, they're sort of expected from Soft. They've got their particular looks, but they do have a couple change-ups here, but they do have a bunch of bosses, the kind of characters that we expect. Now, I'm not going to do any spoiler-heavy stuff here. I do want to talk about how the enemies work, some of the problems we see, actually, in this game, as well as what we've seen in Dark Souls, and the problems that a lot of these kind of games end up having. But I do want to say that one thing you notice right away when you're exploring is that the AI is not very good in these games. Dark Souls titles have got away with this, not only because they have a mixture of the narrative making sense, they're undead for a lot of these characters, they're monsters, they're not going to be sitting there playing fucking games of charades and answering perfect every single time. But when you get an open world, now you start getting things that are a little bit odd. You'll get characters that aren't hiding around a corner because there's no corner for them. In the overworld, they're just standing there, sort of pod people. But because of the way the game has worked in the past, that was okay. And in Elden Ring, a little bit noticeable. You get these characters that are just standing there. They're not doing a lot. You watch them from far off. You'll see many times them sort of shift around maybe, and you'll definitely get an idea of possibly who is most dangerous in that group or who might be watching. You can certainly identify, hey, this character may attack me with that torch. They may attack me from horseback. What does horseback mean, though? Because they won't go into an attack animation until you actually fight them. So just because you can see them, just because they're not necessarily interacting with you, doesn't mean when you do go and fight them, it won't be highly dangerous. This is something we see right at the starting of the game when you go out and there's the guy on a horseback and you see him and you see his lance and you think to yourself, at least I did, oh man, gotta watch out for that lance. But I gotta tell you right now, that horse kicked my ass way more times than that lance ever did. A unique feel to the game that I think really does help in the overall draw for it for different people. It runs headlong into one of From Software's crowning achievements, though, which, like I said, is mystery. There's a duality of mystery that they've always had, this mystery within their narrative, which in part was loosely told through just like a series of notes and eclectic different sentences from bad guys and your own ideas on what may be occurring in the gameplay itself, never really knowing what an enemy was going to do until you bump up against them. And it really is elevated here. For example, there's skeletons. You go and see them and you think, I can take these guys on. I'm pretty good level and I know what I'm doing. You get ready to attack them, and not only do they resurrect, but they also have forearms, and one of their attacks is to basically throw their arms out like a child throwing a tantrum, but a child that's got blades on his arms. And then you, as the player, have to decide how far away you want to get from them. Can you kite them? Do you want to get up close to them? Do you want to try to pick them apart a piece at a time? And this is something that the horse, the travel, the overworld all allows for a completely different feel than the prior games we've got. And there isn't a lot of exact information about a lot of these characters. You can buy things within the inventory that will tell you a weakness of the character. There's the occasional environmental storytelling, but there's still that mystery, that duality of mystery. For example, even look at this. Look at the items, the Ashes of War. These are burned out bits of weapon arts from heroes prior to you. Brush them onto the weapons, you get one of their arts, but it's never really fully explained where they came from. You're usually told what their main primary use is, but then everything after that is experimentation. Everything when you see an enemy is experimentation. I can't tell you how many times I ended up fighting a guy in this game where instead of most other open games where you see a guy with a gun and you're like, yeah, good chance that guy's going to shoot me. Here, you get in a fight with a guy with a gun and suddenly he's spin kicking and beating you with the stock of the gun. And you're like, why, dude? Seriously. And that's where From excels is mystery. And that's paid off in the visuals big time. Something that, like I said, we don't see in a lot of other games. Let me give you a comparison for a second. Forbidden West, it just came out. When you're playing that game, if you see a character that looks somewhat like a reverse Tyrannosaurus Rex that's made of neon and glowy robot stuff, and it looks like it somewhat has rocket launchers on the side, there's almost no question that those are rocket launchers. The mystery is in maybe where it came from, but the actual majesty of it is more in its size, not in something you're going to discover as you continue to fight them. The sense of unknown is incredibly high in Elden Ring, though, because you're engaging with characters and sometimes you have no clue. They've got a sword and a shield, but maybe they have a special skill that can shoot air at you and blow you off a walkway. Yes, we all know what I'm talking about. Or as I showed in the review, you come up on flying characters and you're like, hey, man, I can take them on. You see that they've got blades on their legs. You're like, no problem. I know what to watch out for. And then they friggin' throw barrels at you. In no way, shape, or form can somebody plan for them to throw barrels at you. It doesn't even look like a thing. And instead, the first time they stick their claws into a barrel and throw it at you, you're just completely shocked. And many times you're like me and you're just dumbfounded as you explode. And that ability to mix in mystery with mayhem and with murder, and in the defining trait, which is what you see originally from the character themselves, they almost all have a secret. They almost all have a tertiary or even fourth, fifth, or sixth way of attacking you or doing something. And that's not even including them in groups. And that's something that cannot be overindulged, is mystery. Now, at times it's been difficult sometimes to figure out exactly what a From Software game is trying to tell you, but it was backed up by gameplay chops. Here, you still have a lot of that mystery, but you have better gameplay chops in an open world, and you can sort of identify exactly what's going on just by continued experimentation and use. And the world building that goes there is phenomenal. Let me give you one more example. So you see trolls, you see these giant creatures, they're pulling wagons and machines of some kind, and you see dragons and you fight them and you're like, okay, so maybe this dragon isn't that hard. And you go back and you realize, oh no, he's actually pretty tough, and you move to somebody else, setting it up so that there's a lot of nuance here and there and sort of picking and deciding who you're going to want to fight. So you go and level up, but you also need to decide the dangers you want to incorporate into that upgrading. Do you want to come at the bosses, or do you want to come at the normal characters, overworld, underworld? In Elden Ring, the mystery is that you really have to look closely, and you do have to experience. A lot of times you have to actually go in and try something to see even what's going to happen. In Elden Ring, the mystery is that you really have to look closely and you have to experiment, which I think a lot of games don't want you to experiment as much. They feel a little bit nervous about it. So when you see this world, you see this dragon, and you see these trolls, and you're like, wow, these trolls, they're huge, they're hard. You fight one or two of them, and you're like, these guys must be the worst, biggest bad guys. And then you see trolls carrying this wagon, like I talked about in the review, and there's spikes through them, and they're carrying the wagon, and you're like, who the hell is big enough to do that? And then you start fighting some of the bosses. And the first time you fight some of these bosses, one of the things that I felt was so influential in my enjoyment of the bosses was that visually, they're highly busy at times. But if you actually look at what's going on with a lot of those bosses, not all of them, but a lot of them, especially the first couple, they're very good skill gates again, where you start to see them and you're like, you know what? This guy's not doing a lot. He's got this kind of battle, a tactic. He's got this kind for far away. He's got this time for up close. And he really doesn't adjust very much. But visually, he looks like he's doing a ton of shit. In fact, if you slow it down, you start to look at the first two in particular, and you start to sort of see what they're doing. You're like, man, these guys, they're really not that difficult at all. I just sort of need to experiment, stab, figure out a little bit how much damage I'm doing, maybe summon help, maybe summon some creatures to attack with me. And you start to get this idea of the power of this boss. When you defeat those first two, you might think to yourself, oh, okay, I sort of get it. I sort of got it. And I've had people say this about the game. You see it on Twitter. People be like, oh man, you know what? Bosses ain't too hard. And they're all pretty much, there's one boss in particular where you're seeing a lot of people go like, oh my God, this boss is tough. What I do think hits and happens here is that because of the open world, one of the problems that can happen is that there's a little bit of an atrophy of skills. So let me explain this really quickly. If you continually do the same stuff and learn how to do the same stuff over and over and over again, the atrophy of skill, even across an hour, is very low. You understand when to block, you understand exactly what you need to do, sort of muscle memory. As you extend and you sort of change the world and the way you're engaging in it, for example, the overworld and the horse, there's a false sense of security that might rise up until you go back in to fight a boss and you're like, oh my God, I need to dodge again. I can't run away on my horse. And there's sort of a stretching out of the time between those two things. And I think the world building pays off in that. You see hints of these bad guys, but a lot of people missed them. A lot of people would see this particular, I don't want to spoil anything, but there's one particular character that you see and you're sort of like, huh, he's unique. Why is he out here? What's happening? So you take him out and then you go over a hill or two and suddenly you're like, oh, I understand why he's here. And I love that. I love that kind of over-the-hill storytelling. And you get it environmentally within the game world a lot. Even little things like the gold of the trees. So at certain times at night, the trees will sort of shimmer down this gold. And if you get touched by it, your ability to gain more runes when you kill enemies goes up. And it's not even really explained to you. It just happens. And I think that is one place where when you look at other games, and something I talk about in the Walking the Walks is what pays off, what makes you feel like something's over the hill, what makes you feel like something happened prior to me getting there. And with the ghost, almost spectral way in which From Software has their heroes, does it always work exactly that way? And I would say in this game, there are some issues. One of the things I want to point out is because I do a Walking the Walk doesn't mean I think a game is perfect. In fact, many times they're not. I've done Walking the Walk for multiple titles that don't actually really engage me from a gameplay segment, but they do on the open world. Here, it's sort of both, and I definitely want to talk about that. But I want to talk for a second about how sound can also help this. It's something that, especially in these games with their really lean soundtracks, you'll notice that it's quite important to understand what's going on around you by listening. They indicate what you've missed in particular. For example, From Software is very good at having little tiny audio indicators that something may be secret in a location, whether it's a whirring or a clasping sound or metal scraping or just an enemy moving. They can indicate that you've hit a wall instead of an enemy even. And you get those awesome animations for sure, but the sound can actually help you sometimes, especially in those really important, really messy moments of combat where maybe it's a little hard to identify exactly what's going on. Maybe it's the sound of a summons or the sound of your summons. During the game, shifting on the other side of a wall and without actually seeing him, you can actually hear some enemies, pretty big ones, and you can sort of guess what their size is. It's one of those creatures that's going to kill me quickly. Or maybe you hear wolves baying out in the woods when you're riding your horse around, and you can hear them breathing next to you when you summon them. You can hear those dogs. It works so well to contain and engage everything as one solid piece. Sound is important. It's vital for a game like this, I personally think. And it doesn't mean you can't play it without audio. It just means that for me, I think the level of audio and the information that it gives to you and what you can take out of it is incredibly high, very high. It can inform you that somebody's around the corner. And trust me, Elden Ring does have its fair share of mysterious guys just waiting in a corner to leap on you. But when you have that mix of sound, leaner music, but still music, I think in a game, in prior games, those moments of tenseness are something that you can sort of identify in a lot of open world games. I've talked about this before, where you're going to hear a music stinger before the bad guy shows up. And you're like, come on, man. That doesn't really work. Here you may hear the baying of wolves, which I do think you could consider a spoiler if you wanted. It's not really a spoiler, though, because that makes sense for them. It's not like they're opening their mouths and they're suddenly playing the Valkyries or something, and you're like, dude, I absolutely know what's happening right now. But you start to wonder why a guy didn't drop out in front of you at times, because maybe you heard a sound or you didn't hear a sound, and now you're wondering, where the hell is that guy? Isn't there supposed to be a guy around this corner? There was every other corner. And it allows for that mystery to build on you. Then those de facto places that I think Dark Souls fans have always expected a bad guy, it's going to change a little bit in Elden Ring because it is a wider outdoor area. So how do they do that? How do they give you those sounds? Do they do the baying of wolves? Sometimes what they do is silence, and I think this is spectacular. There's a lot of times where you're racing around and you'll see skeletons. Now, I don't know if you know this, most skeletons no vocal cords. So it's not like they're going to be sitting there chatting about, Happy Cathy back in the frickin' old town that they're in and how much they like her. Instead, there's going to be nothing. And that's what happens a lot of times here. So you jump on your horse and you're riding and you hear this one bad guy, you take him out, you hear the wolves, and then you go over another corner and it's silence. And you're like, okay, there's nobody here. And as you continue to ride, suddenly you just see off in the corner these like 4 skeletons doing some drudgery, some gnarly patrol that doesn't seem to really be anything but ingrained in their bones. And you're like, that's sort of creepy. It works really well. I think the sound works well. I think the sound of the weapon impacts tell a player so much. They do a really good job here, especially when it matters so much. Now, admittedly, the sound in these games is more that when you hit an enemy. I don't know how to describe that, but it's got a little bit of a saccharine sound to it, and I know a lot of people aren't necessarily in love with it. It certainly doesn't have a more realistic thrumming sound for weapons and stuff like that, but for me, it works. I think it does a great job. And it tells you a lot of times, did I do a lot of damage, some damage, a little bit of damage? Did it bounce off? Now, you'll see a lot of times a weapon bounce off, but sometimes you'll see it go through and you can still hear a sound that will also indicate exactly what happened. Did I hit both enemies? That's also vital, especially in some areas where you don't lock on. If you're a person who doesn't like to lock on, or you just didn't, or you did, but your weapon has a long range to it. Sometimes you'll hit 2 guys and you can hear that sound. And it really informs transforms the gamer. It's vital for that kind of stuff. It helps with world building. It helps connect everything together and make you feel like every impact, everything you're doing is impacting everything else in the game world. I would say that the AI issues at times are sort of ignored by some gamers, in fact, due to the silence of a lot of the enemies. So if those enemies were chatting all the time, right? If they were talking all the time, I think a lot of gamers would look at the AI and go, But because they're not, a lot of people are like, well, okay, so they're not talking, and I think we obviously know why they're not. But what I'm saying is it helps. It sells it a little bit. And that silence is, in a weird way, sound itself. It's something that they've chosen to make sure that game sounds aren't playing during that time other than your environmentals. And there's very lean music. And you sort of have to figure out, is this a spot where they've chosen to do that to set me up? Or is it really something coming out of the darkness? Now, I usually don't talk about tech in these games, especially in the Walking the Walks. I will discuss that, of course, tech has been an issue with this title. It's had a notorious run of bad PC elements that have popped up, and they've patched in fixes that have broken other stuff. It's really been a pretty difficult run for them technically. It actually was mixed on Steam for a while and has now gone back up because of some patches. But even if you love this game, there's definitely tech issues. Even if you didn't have them, you probably know somebody who did. And they're pretty severe tech issues. And I think when you look at this game, you can see that From has decided, hey, let's take this engine, let's continue to revamp it and stretch it across the open world. And one of the things that we do get is, and something that does crop up, you can see multiple GDCs about this, where developers talk about, do we change engines? Do we go to a different engine? And I think From has probably pushed this engine as far as they can go. It's definitely a spot where at certain places you'll notice there's not a lot of foliage, some really low detail textures. Of course, they didn't have DLSS day one. I don't think they still have it. So you're missing some things there technically. And when you push an engine this far, you're adding an overworld and an underworld to it. You can certainly get positions and possibilities of, let's say, memory swapping, of buffer issues, that kind of stuff. And it's what we do see with the tech. I would like to see them jump to a new tech. I just would. I think it's time, and I think a lot of these new engines offer an incredible amount of robustness in how they allow for somebody who still wants their game to look a particular way, but be able to do it not only at a faster iteration speed, but maybe not spend so much time on trying to work around the idiosyncrasies of a particular engine. What we do see and what we do worry about is the change of the graphics. When you look at Elden Ring versus most other games that have come out, Forbidden West is one of them that's come out nearby. You have this verdant, this almost incredibly organic looking location, but you don't have near the serpentine twists and back and forth and shortcuts that you have in Elden Ring. You certainly wouldn't want them to lose that. I would like to see them jump into this and in some way add their own sort of restrictions to what they want to do with whatever game they make, because I don't think that they should be forced to do another open world game if they don't want to. But what I would like to see them do is jump forward in tech, because we do see a lot of issues here with the tech. We see a lot of problems where I would say you notice that there's a lot of pushing against the tech, and that does happen. And it happens, most developers will talk about this. You can see multiple GDCs where companies have moved to, let's say, Unreal from their original engines, and they talk about the difficulty, of course, but they also talk about sort of getting to the point to where they're like, oh my God, we can iterate so much faster. Even though we knew our old engine, so many people are working on these new engines, so many different changes, so many different configuration testings that you can do that are done automatically for you in Unreal or in Unity or in any of those engines. Please don't go to Unity, but you guys get my drift. So this one's a little bit different. This Walk in the Walk's a little bit different. I wanted to talk about various things that were specific and then walk around the game world and still do the Walking the Walk. And just looking at this place, looking at the beauty of all these locations, I have to say it is stunning. It's a game that I think everybody doesn't have to like. And I see a lot of people saying, I want every game to be like Elden Ring. Oh my God, I can't believe how good Elden Ring is at storytelling, the lack of quests telling you go here, go there. First of all, I sort of want to put a bit of a pin in that. I want to bring something up. I have no issues with people liking or hating something, but I do have issues with not necessarily factual information. The first thing we should look at is Assassin's Creed, a series that I have not been in love with, but a series that I will defend particular aspects of, because if somebody complains about them without knowing what they're talking about, they become untrue. And I've always believed that the best argument is one that's actually backed up by facts. When you look at Assassin's Creed games, you can not only turn off 90% of the noise and bullshit you get in the game, they do better with their verbalization of quest markers and their information they give the quest taker from the quest giver than From does. Now, we like the mystery. I love the mystery, but I got to point that out because I saw people saying, "Oh my God, here's what Ubisoft's UX would be." First of all, I don't like Ubisoft's menus and inventories very much, but I got to tell you, the one in Dark Souls or the one in Elden Ring sucks balls. That inventory, go here to see the detailed mini review or mini view. Go here, click here, try to compare. Guess what? You can't. All these weird things that it has. It's not perfect. But I think that sort of pretending something else is built and unchangeable removes the argument. It sort of makes it a non-necessary argument. Instead, say, yeah, okay, Ubisoft games can remove the HUD, 90% of the HUD. Horizon Zero Dawn can remove. Now what are we looking at? And what we're looking at is not necessarily fundamentally different games, but certainly games that have decided to focus on different things. And I, for one, don't want that to go away. I see a lot of people are like, everything needs to be this. And I got to tell you, this is just me as a game player. I don't want every game to be Daggerfall, even though Daggerfall is one of my favorite games of all time. I love Space Harrier. I didn't want every game to be Space Harrier. That makes no fucking sense. I want Space Harrier to be Space Harrier. You want quality of life improvements to most assuredly go into your various different parts of a game. But when you look at these kind of arguments, you have to go, hey, wait, that's not necessarily true. We need to be more true in the argument. That way we can actually pinpoint true problems that exist and improve them. Admittedly, one of the true problems that a lot of people have felt From Games had was a lack of sort of making people understand things. There were some issues with onboarding of new gamers, and especially when you have brand new gamers all the time coming in, you can't say, hey, just go back and play Dark Souls 1. It's like if the person's 18, 17, just got their new system, they want to know what Elden Ring is offering. I've had that before. People be like, Final Fantasy 7, man. It's like, dude, the guy wasn't even alive when Final Fantasy came out, you old bastard. So you guys have to really realize where I come from, is looking at all these games and saying, man, this is great. I'd love to see them adjust that, alter that. I don't want to take away Dark Souls because Elden Ring was made. That's another thing. Some people I know like Dark Souls games more than Elden Ring. Yeah, surprise, surprise. I know a lot of people are like, Elden Ring's better in all ways. I know a number of people who do not agree with that. They're just not on Twitter telling you that. So there's a place there for everybody to look at these games, be inspired, change their ideas of things. And I'm hoping that continues. So when looking at all these, walking around, there's so many different mythologies, so many different ideas. The round table I talked about, the trees in the background here, the swamp, everything. There's so many different locations I really like in this game. Something that I would say Dark Souls didn't get or wasn't able to give as easily, which is that ability for you to visualize everywhere you've come and gone, or at least a larger amount of everywhere you've come and gone, which is certainly Elden Ring's strength. Being able to stand on a location, look to your left and see swamps, look to your right and see a bog, look behind you and see mountains, look in front of you and see prairies, and everywhere you go, you can see it. And then knowing that wicker worked under that is this labyrinthian cave system, these caverns, and you're just like, I can't wait to go everywhere. With that sense of mystery, the sense of exploration, to me, that's why I feel that Elden Ring really is setting it off. While it's doing so well, while its scores are so high, when you review a game, you never exactly know how high a game is going to review with others. And I definitely felt when I was playing it, I had a lot of technical issues, but I felt when I was playing it, I sort of knew what I was playing and knew where it was going and knew how it wanted to do things. And it really did reach out to two different kinds of gamers this time. And I think for the most part, it probably satisfied both. There are some people I know who definitely don't like the way it's put together, and I absolutely see that. And there's definitely issues with it. That's one of the problems with a lot of discussion around classic games. Oh, it's got to be, perfect, that kind of thing. There is no game that's perfect. There's always issues. This game, for instance, like I've said before, and I said in this video, is the HUD, the inventory, that kind of system is just absolutely balls. But as a game, it is a classic, and I've really enjoyed doing this walking the walk for you. Now, we just got to hope that footage is good, and we'll see how it is. But if you like these videos, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike them, give it a thumbs down.